What would you do if, in the middle of a crowded first-class cabin, someone looked you in the eye and told you, "You people don't belong here"? Would you fight back? Would you walk away, or would you hold your ground in silence, knowing the truth was on your side? For 17-year-old Caleb Anderson, Jr., a quiet black teenager with dreams of becoming an architect, that moment came at 36,000 feet on Flight 227. The leather seats, the hum of the engines, the gentle clink of glassware. It should have been an ordinary trip. Instead, it became a test of dignity, courage, and quiet power. What the flight attendant didn't know was that Caleb's father wasn't just another passenger. He was the man who owned the airline. And in the hours that followed, decisions would be made that would shake the company to its core and change the way it treated every single passenger. So, what happened in those tense minutes between the insult and the truth? How did a teenager's silence ignite a ripple that reached the highest levels of power? Stay with us to find out. If this story moves you, remember to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps us tell stories that matter. The hum of the engines was steady, a soft background vibration that passengers quickly stopped noticing. The air in the first-class cabin of Aurora Pacific Airlines Flight 227 was warm with the scent of fresh leather and citrus wipes. The lighting was a golden glow, calculated to relax people who paid 4 figures for a ticket from Boston to San Francisco. Every detail spoke of comfort and control. And then, in a moment so sharp it sliced through that polished calm, a voice cut in. "You people don't belong here." The words were low, almost a hiss, but in the hush of the cabin they carried farther than the speaker intended. Conversation stilled. A champagne flute clinked gently against a tray. Somewhere near the front, someone's tablet paused mid-video. Caleb Anderson, Jr. froze. 17 years old, tall and lean. He had been halfway through sketching the arc of a suspension bridge in his notebook when the sentence landed. It wasn't the first time he'd heard those words, or something like them, but hearing them here, in a cabin that reeked of privilege and exclusivity, hit differently. He looked up slowly. Standing in the aisle beside him was Diane Mercer, the lead flight attendant. She wore her uniform like armor, her blonde hair pulled into a severe twist that seemed to pull her features into something sharp. The expression on her face was not neutral service. It was ownership, the kind of look that says, "I control this space." Caleb's dark eyes met hers. He didn't flinch. He didn't give her the satisfaction of visible anger. He simply said, quietly, "Excuse me." Diane's lips thinned. She leaned in slightly. Voice still low, but laced with the kind of certainty that comes from years of unchecked bias. "You heard me." The hum of the engines seemed louder now. Caleb could feel his pulse in his ears. Around him, a few passengers shifted uncomfortably, the way people do when something wrong is happening, but they aren't sure if it's their place to get involved. He recognized the signs, the sidelong glances, the polite half-pretend to be focused on something else. He turned a page in his notebook slowly, giving himself a moment. The graphite pencil in his hand felt heavier. He had a choice: snap back, or hold his ground in silence. And in that moment, his father's voice came to him, from countless conversations over the years. "Sometimes, son, you win more by staying steady than by striking back. Let them see themselves in the mirror of your calm." So Caleb kept his voice level. "I'm in my assigned seat," he said, pointing lightly to the ticket stub tucked into the seat pocket. "2B. Diane's eyes flicked to it, but the movement was almost dismissive. "We'll see about that." She straightened up and walked away toward the front galley. Caleb watched her go, the tension knotting in his shoulders. He wanted to think maybe she'd just had a bad day, that it wasn't what it sounded like, but experience told him otherwise. Those 3 words, "you people don't belong," were never innocent. They were designed to shrink, to make you small. He drew in a slow breath, let it out, and tried to refocus on his sketch. The pencil traced lines, curves, the cables of a bridge, something strong enough to span a wide gap, something built to carry weight without breaking. Minutes passed. The cabin settled again, but the atmosphere was different. Caleb could feel it. He noticed a man in 1A Asian, mid-30s. Sharp suit glanced back briefly before returning to his laptop. A silver-haired woman in 3A lowered her book just enough to watch Diane move down the aisle. Observers, witnesses. He didn't know their names yet, but he felt their quiet awareness. Diane returned a moment later, not with an apology, but with an outstretched hand. "Boarding pass," she said curtly. Caleb handed it over without hesitation. Her eyes scanned the details. Caleb Anderson, Jr., Seat 2B, Priority 1, perfectly in order. But facts weren't the point here. Facts rarely were in moments like this. She returned it without thanks and pivoted toward the man in 2A with a honeyed smile. "Pre-departure beverage for you. Sir Champagne. Sparkling water." Her tone was warm, inviting a complete reversal from the frost she'd directed at Caleb seconds earlier. Caleb didn't miss it. Neither did a few others. The man in 2A accepted champagne, and Diane walked away without even glancing at Caleb to ask what he'd like. He sat back, feeling the weight of the silence that followed. The first-class cabin was designed to be serene, but serenity here felt like a lid on a boiling pot. He took out his noise-canceling headphones, a birthday gift from his father, and slipped them on. Not to block out sound entirely, but to create a small island of his own in the sea of subtle hostility. Somewhere behind him, the cabin door sealed with a heavy thunk. The safety demonstration began. The aircraft pushed back from the gate. Caleb let his eyes drift to the oval window, watching the ground crew in neon vests wave signals. Boston's skyline receded as they taxied. He thought about the last time he'd flown to San Francisco. It had been uneventful. Tara Guyen, one of the junior flight attendants on that trip, had been friendly and professional, treating him like any other passenger. He hoped she might be working today, but he hadn't seen her yet. The plane lifted off, engines roaring for a moment before settling into the steady climb. Seatbelt signs chimed off. Service began. Diane moved methodically down the aisle, offering warm nuts and wine to each passenger. When she reached Caleb's row, she stopped. He was halfway through shading a section of his bridge drawing, headphones on. She tapped him sharply on the shoulder. He jumped slightly, sliding one ear cup off. "Headphones off when speaking to crew," she said flatly. "It's policy." Caleb knew there was no such policy. He'd flown enough to be sure, but he simply nodded. "Understood," he said, setting them aside. She jotted something on her notepad as if it were an infraction. "Dinner order," she asked, tone like she was enduring an inconvenience. "We have the seared halibut or the filet mignon." "The filet? Medium rare," Caleb replied. She gave the faintest sniff. "And to drink Coke is fine," he said. Her pen scratched the page. Without another word, she moved on. Caleb leaned back. This was going to be a long flight. Outside the window, the sun caught the edge of the wing, turning it into a silver blade slicing through the sky. He stared at it for a moment, thinking about the hours ahead, wondering how much more obvious she'd make her dislike. He didn't know it yet, but this was only the first layer. The worst moment, the one that would echo far beyond this flight, was still coming. And when it did, it would not end at 30,000 feet. It would follow them all the way down to the ground. Hours earlier, Caleb had been standing at the gate in Boston Logan's Terminal B, watching the pre-boarding process unfold with the quiet patience that came naturally to him. Business travelers lined up with their rolling suitcases, checking watches and glancing at phones. Families with children clustered near the stanchions, trying to keep kids occupied. Over by the windows, sunlight poured through in long golden rectangles, catching the metallic curve of the Aurora Pacific Airbus A350 parked at the gate. He wasn't dressed like most of the other first-class passengers. A black hoodie, clean and well-fitted, over a plain white t-shirt, dark jeans, broken in but crisp, white sneakers that gleamed under the terminal lights. Over one shoulder, his charcoal gray backpack, not stuffed to bursting, but organized with care. In his hand, a sketchbook with a worn leather cover and a mechanical pencil clipped to the spine. The boarding agent scanned his pass with a quick beep. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Anderson," she said, professional and polite. Caleb gave a small nod of thanks and walked down the jet bridge, the air growing cooler and quieter as he left the chatter of the terminal behind. Stepping into the aircraft felt like crossing into another world. The first-class cabin was a study in subdued opulence. Cream leather seats with high privacy shelves curved around each passenger like personal cocoons. Soft amber lighting pooled from overhead panels. The scent was a blend of fresh leather, faint citrus, and something floral that he couldn't quite place. Every surface gleamed, from the brushed aluminum seat controls to the glass partition panels. A flight attendant near the door offered a warm smile and gestured toward his seat. This was not Diane Mercer. This was Tara Nguyen, and Caleb recognized her immediately from a previous trip. She had a way of making eye contact that felt like genuine connection, not just trained customer service. "Good to see you again," she said softly, as if acknowledging something without making a scene. "Seat 2B is right this way." Caleb smiled back, feeling a small measure of ease return to his chest. "Thanks." He settled into the seat. The pod design offered both privacy and an open view down the aisle. He stowed his backpack under the ottoman, slid the sketchbook into the side pocket, and took a moment to absorb the atmosphere. 2 rows ahead, a man in 1A was already typing furiously on a laptop. His black hair neatly parted, his suit tailored within an inch of precision. Across from him, in 1D, a woman with silver hair and a cashmere shawl was reading a thick hardcover novel. It was a quiet, almost reverent environment, the kind of space where people didn't raise their voices unless they had to. Caleb liked it that way. He pulled out his pencil and began sketching, his mind wandering to a design idea he'd been developing for weeks, a pedestrian bridge with sweeping curves that would look almost weightless over a river. That was when Diane Mercer first appeared in his peripheral vision. She was moving down the aisle with a clipboard, eyes scanning seats like a general reviewing troops. Her uniform was immaculate, every seam sharp, every button in place. Her gaze flicked over each passenger in a quick appraisal. When it landed on Caleb, it didn't move on right away. She slowed. The pause was just long enough to feel intentional. Her eyes swept over his hoodie, his sneakers, his sketchbook. The faintest crease appeared between her brows, the kind that suggested something didn't fit her mental picture. "Can I help you?" she asked. The tone was not an offer. It was a test. Caleb looked up from his sketch. "No, thank you. I'm fine." Her eyes shifted to the boarding pass tucked into his seat pocket. Without asking, she reached for it, scanned the details, and placed it back without comment. No smile, no welcome. Just a curt nod before she continued down the aisle. The moment was small, but it left a shadow. Caleb had flown enough to know the difference between casual indifference and deliberate sizing up. This was the latter. Minutes later, Tara returned to offer pre-departure beverages. She asked the man in 2A first, then turned to Caleb with that same easy warmth. "And for you, Mr. Anderson Coke. Sparkling water juice Coke would be great," he said. She nodded and moved toward the galley. Caleb noticed Diane leaning against the wall near the front, speaking in low tones to another crew member. Their words didn't carry, but every so often, Diane's eyes flicked back toward him. The cabin door closed with a muted thud. Safety announcements began. Caleb fastened his seatbelt and let his gaze drift to the window. Outside, Boston's runways stretched out under a pale afternoon sky. Somewhere across the country, his father was wrapping up meetings at Aurora Pacific headquarters. He'd see him tonight in San Francisco, maybe over dinner at their favorite Italian place. That thought brought a small smile. The plane pushed back from the gate. The engine spooled up, a deepening roar that vibrated through the seat. As they taxied, Caleb's mind flickered briefly to past trips, some smooth, some with minor annoyances, but nothing that had left a mark. He hoped this one would be the same. They lifted off smoothly, banking westward. The city shrank beneath them, a patchwork of brick and asphalt giving way to winter-bare trees and rivers glinting in the light. Seatbelt signs chimed off. Service began. Diane approached again, her posture precise, pen and notepad ready. Dinner selection. She asked the man in 2A, her voice pleasant, professional. He ordered halibut. Then she turned to Caleb, and the shift in tone was subtle, but unmistakable cooler. Flatter. Filet mignon, medium rare, he said evenly. And to drink, she asked. "Just a Coke," he replied. Her eyebrow ticked up ever so slightly. "Very well." She scribbled it down and moved on. Caleb leaned back, feeling the edges of tension in his body. He glanced toward Tara, who was working a few rows behind, with an efficiency that didn't draw attention, but kept everything moving. She caught his eye for half a second, offered the smallest reassuring smile, then looked away to continue her work. It was in these small moments, Caleb thought, that people revealed themselves. Some, like Tara, built up a space with quiet kindness. Others, like Diane, chipped away at it with glances and tones sharp enough to cut. He returned to his sketchbook, shading the lines of the bridge, imagining it spanning not just a river, but two worlds that rarely touched. In the back of his mind, he wondered how long he'd be able to keep his world intact on this flight. Because already, he could feel a current pulling towards something heavier, something he hadn't invited, but might not be able to avoid. And he was right. For the first hour of the flight, Caleb managed to keep his focus on the sketchbook in front of him. The rhythm of pencil against paper had always been his way of shutting out the noise of the world, of building something beautiful in the middle of whatever storm might be brewing. But he could feel it even without looking up. Diane Mercer's presence had a way of filling the aisle like a shadow that followed him no matter which direction he turned. It started small, almost imperceptible. She would pass by his seat and glance down as if checking for something wrong. Once, she paused to adjust the headrest of the man in 2A and then lingered a beat too long, her eyes sweeping over Caleb's hoodie and sneakers before moving on. When she handed out warm towels, hers landed on his tray with a slight slap rather than the gentle placement she gave others. None of it was enough to start an argument. All of it added up. Caleb felt the old, familiar tug of an inner debate. Do you ignore it and hope it fades? Or do you acknowledge it and risk making it worse? At 17, he'd already learned that in certain situations, being right didn't always protect you. Sometimes it painted a bigger target on your back. He glanced across the aisle at the silver-haired woman in 3A. She had been watching more than she read. Once, when Diane walked past, Caleb saw the woman's eyes narrow just slightly. There was recognition there, not of him, but of the game being played. Taranian worked the opposite aisle, offering refills with a quiet efficiency that kept her moving. At one point, she leaned in toward Caleb's seat. "Everything good here?" "Mr. Anderson?" she asked softly. "Yes, thank you," he said. Her presence was a small anchor in the current. Diane reappeared during the drink service. She offered wine to the passenger in 1A, then champagne to the couple in 3B, her voice warm and lilting. When she reached Caleb's row, her tone cooled. "Coke." "Right," she said, without looking directly at him. "Yes," Caleb replied. She poured it into a glass with more foam than liquid, set it down without a coaster, and moved on without another word. The glass slid slightly when he reached for it, the carbonation still fizzing over the rim. He dabbed at the spill with his napkin, not because it bothered him, but because it was something to do besides react. Half an hour later, the cabin settled into that mid-flight stillness where most passengers either slept, worked, or watched movies. Caleb leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment. The hum of the engines blended with the faint clink of ice in glasses. It could have been peaceful. The tap on his shoulder jolted him back. He opened his eyes to find Diane standing there again, pen and notepad in hand. "I'll be taking your lunch order now," she said. Caleb blinked. "I thought I gave it earlier." "You did," she said. "I'm confirming. We wouldn't want any mistakes." The pause before that last word was deliberate. He recognized it as another small jab. "Filet mignon, medium rare," he repeated evenly. She scribbled it down like she hadn't already done so, and moved on. Caleb felt a quiet heat in his chest. He'd been on enough flights to know this wasn't normal procedure. He also knew the problem wasn't his order, or his seat, or even the soda. The problem was that Diane Mercer had decided from the moment she saw him that he didn't belong here, and she wasn't going to let that go. He tried to put his attention back on his sketch. The bridge lines were almost complete, but his hand hesitated before the final curve. He thought about his father's voice again, about keeping steady, but he also thought about something his grandmother once told him. Sometimes silence isn't grace. Sometimes it's permission. From the corner of his eye, he saw Ethan Park in 1A glance back again. This time, their eyes met. Ethan's look was subtle but unmistakable. "I see what's happening." Caleb gave the smallest nod in return. Another hour passed. Caleb had settled into a movie when he noticed movement at the front of the cabin. Diane was speaking quietly to Tara. Their voices didn't carry, but the tone did. Diane's eyes flicked toward Caleb, her lips tightening before she turned away. Tara's expression was harder to read concern, maybe even discomfort. A few minutes later, Tara approached Caleb's seat. "Mr. Anderson, can I get you anything?" "Another Coke. Some water." Her voice was warm, but there was something underneath it, a slight hesitation. "I'm fine. Thank you," he said. He wanted to ask what Diane had said, but he knew this wasn't the place. When the meal service began, Diane moved with the same precision as always. But when she reached Caleb, the plate landed on his tray with a dull thud. The steak was there, cooked correctly, but the side dishes were missing. He didn't say anything. Instead, He picked up his fork, cut a piece of the meat, and chewed slowly, letting the flavor linger. It wasn't about the food. It was about not giving her the reaction she wanted. As she passed again to clear plates, she asked, finished already in a tone that made the simple question feel like an accusation. Yes, Caleb said calmly, handing over his tray. She took it without a word. By now, the tension had seeped into the air like a slow leak. Even passengers not paying close attention could sense it. Caleb noticed Victoria Lane glance toward him again, her eyes steady and assessing, like someone cataloging details for later use. Why, he shifted in his seat, leaning his head back. He told himself to focus on the hours ahead, on landing in San Francisco, on seeing his father. But he couldn't shake the feeling that Diane wasn't done. The small slights had been building, each one laid carefully on top of the last. And in his gut, he knew there was going to be a moment when it would all break open. He didn't know what form it would take. He didn't know when it would happen, but he felt the weight of it building like a storm just out of sight, waiting for the right gust of wind to sweep in and change the course of the flight. Somewhere near the back of the cabin, a chime sounded as the seatbelt sign lit up briefly for turbulence. The plane shifted slightly, a gentle roll that passed in seconds. Caleb steadied his drink and went back to his movie. But his mind was no longer in it. He was watching the aisle in his peripheral vision, waiting, and sure enough, before long, he saw Diane moving toward him again, her eyes fixed not on his seat but on him, like a hawk sighting its target. Whatever was coming next, Caleb had the unsettling sense that this was still only the beginning. The seatbelt sign had been off for nearly an hour when Caleb decided to stretch his legs. He had been sitting still, sketching and half watching a film, but his legs were starting to ache from the stillness. He stood, careful not to bump the man in two-way, and stepped into the aisle. The forward lavatory in the first-class cabin was occupied. A small red in use sign glowed above the door. Caleb turned toward the thin curtain, separating first class from business class, a routine move he had done on other flights when the front restroom was taken. It was common practice. Nobody ever made an issue of it. But before his hand could reach the curtain, a sudden pressure clamped down on his arm. Hard. It was Diane Mercer. Her grip was strong enough to make him stop short. Her face was set in lines of pure indignation. Her voice came low and tight, but the force behind it made the words cut through the cabin air. "Where do you think you're going?" she demanded. Caleb blinked at her, startled. "The lavatory is occupied. I was just going to use the one back there." Her fingers tightened on his arm. "The facilities in the back are for the other passengers," she said, her tone carrying the unmistakable emphasis of "not for you." And then, with a venom that made the temperature drop in Caleb's veins, she leaned closer and delivered the words that made the rest of the cabin seem to hold its breath. "You people don't belong here." It was as if the engines went silent for a beat. Caleb heard nothing but the echo of that phrase, ringing in his head, heavy and ugly. He felt a flash of heat rise in his chest, followed quickly by a deep, hollow ache. He knew what she meant. She didn't mean travelers from Boston. She didn't mean teenagers. She meant him, his skin, his presence, his existence in a place she had decided was off limits. For a moment, he stood perfectly still. He could have pulled away sharply, could have raised his voice and drawn the attention of the entire cabin. Instead, he took a slow breath, meeting her icy stare with a steady gaze of his own. "I see," he said quietly. That was all. He gently pulled his arm free from her grip, his movements calm, deliberate, leaving her with nothing to feed on. But the damage was done. Passengers in nearby seats had heard. The man in 1A, Ethan Park, had paused mid-typing to look over. Victoria Lane in 3A had lowered her book completely. Her expression sharpened like the edge of a blade. Diane straightened, clearly expecting her authority to be unquestioned. But then, a voice spoke from 2 rows back, firm, elegant, and carrying the weight of someone used to being heard. "I beg your pardon." It was Victoria Lane. She was seated upright now, her eyes locked on Diane. "I heard exactly what you just said to that young man, and I have to tell you, I find it both disgusting and unacceptable." Diane's composure flickered. She glanced at Victoria, trying to reclaim her footing. "Ma'am, this is a crew matter. It became my matter." Victoria interrupted. "The moment you laid hands on him and insulted him in my presence, I have been a loyal customer of this airline for decades, and I will not sit by while a passenger, let alone a minor, is treated in such a degrading fashion." Heads turned up and down the cabin. Conversation stopped. Ethan Park closed his laptop, leaning slightly in his seat. "I heard it too," he said, his voice measured but resolute. "It was out of line. Way out of line." Diane's jaw tightened. She could feel the weight of eyes on her now, eyes that were not on her side. She doubled down, her tone sharpening. This passenger was attempting to enter a different cabin. "That is a security concern." "That's not true," Caleb said, his voice still calm, though firmer now. "The front lavatory was in use. I was going to the one in business class. I've done it on other flights with this airline without a problem." His eyes met hers, steady. "And you grabbed my arm." Tara Nguyen, who had been in the galley, stepped forward. "I can confirm that." "Diane, and he's right. It's standard for first-class passengers to use the business lavatory if the forward one's occupied." The tension thickened. Diane's authority was unraveling in front of the passengers she was supposed to be in control of. She gave a quick, clipped response. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to return to your seat. You're causing a disturbance." "That's not true either," Ethan Park said, his tone cooling. "The only disturbance here is coming from you." Victoria's voice joined in again. "You owe this young man an apology." Diane's face flushed. "I will not be spoken to this way by passengers. I am the lead flight attendant on this flight, and I am responsible for safety and security. I'm calling the captain." She spun on her heel and marched toward the cockpit, the sound of her shoes striking the floor like small hammer blows. Caleb let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His heart was steady now, not because the moment hadn't cut deep, but because he knew without needing to raise his voice that he had people on his side. Still, the humiliation clung to him like smoke. Tara gave him a sympathetic look as she passed. "You okay?" she asked quietly. "I'm fine," he said, though the words felt thin. "Thank you." Ethan Park leaned slightly toward him from his seat ahead. "Don't worry. This isn't over." Caleb nodded, then sank back into his seat. The hum of the engines filled the space again, but the mood in the cabin had changed. The golden serenity from earlier was gone, replaced by a taut awareness. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. A few minutes later, the cockpit door opened, and Captain Robert Hale emerged. His presence filled the aisle without effort, a tall man in his early 50s with a calm authority in his stride. His eyes moved from Diane, who stood rigidly at the front, to Caleb, then to Victoria and Ethan. "What seems to be the problem here?" he asked, his voice low and even. Diane launched into her account immediately. Captain, this passenger was non-compliant, attempted to enter another cabin, refused to follow instructions. That's not accurate, Caleb said, his voice clear but not raised. She grabbed my arm and told me I didn't belong here. Victoria Lane spoke next. Captain, I heard it myself. So did Mr. Park. It was as the young man said. Ethan nodded. Every word. Captain Hale's eyes returned to Diane. Is that true? She opened her mouth, but no answer came immediately. The captain's expression hardened. Diane, go to the rear galley. Ms. Nguyen, you're in charge of first-class service for the remainder of the flight. The silence in the cabin was absolute. Diane hesitated for a fraction of a second, then turned and walked through the curtain, disappearing from sight. The storm wasn't over, but the first crack had opened. Captain Hale's presence still lingered in the air long after he disappeared back into the cockpit. The weight of his decision to remove Diane Mercer from the first-class cabin wasn't lost on anyone. It was a public rebuke, one that disrupted the invisible hierarchy of authority that usually kept passengers deferential and crew in control. Caleb sat in his seat, quiet, feeling the cabin slowly begin to breathe again. The tension didn't vanish, but it loosened enough for small sounds to return: the soft clink of ice in a glass, the shuffle of a page turning, the faint hum of the entertainment screens. Even so, he could feel eyes on him, not staring exactly, but checking in, maybe wondering how a 17-year-old could remain so composed in the middle of a confrontation that had clearly rattled the entire cabin. Tara Nguyen reappeared a few minutes later, moving with deliberate calm. She set a fresh Coke on his tray, this time with a coaster and just the right amount of ice. On the house, she said softly, offering a quick smile. Thank you, Caleb said, meaning it. She gave a small nod before continuing down the aisle to check on other passengers. When she reached Victoria Lane's row, the older woman leaned in to say something. Caleb couldn't hear the words, but Victoria glanced in his direction and gave him a small, encouraging smile. Ethan Park, still in 1A, had opened his laptop again but wasn't really typing. Caleb caught him looking back once or twice, as if keeping an eye on things. It was strange, Caleb thought, how in the space of an hour, strangers could become allies simply because they refused to ignore what they saw. Meanwhile, behind the curtain in the business-class galley, Diane Mercer was seething. She stood stiffly near the counter, arms crossed, her mind replaying the scene over and over. The boy's face, the calm way he spoke to her, the passengers siding against her, and the captain taking their word over hers. In her version of the story, she was the one being disrespected, undermined by a manipulative teenager who somehow knew exactly how to turn the cabin against her. It was easier to think that than to consider she might be wrong. Diane wasn't used to this. In more than 20 years of flying, she had built her authority on confidence and decisiveness. She prided herself on running a tight cabin, and she believed her instincts about people were almost always right. And her instinct told her Caleb Anderson did not belong in that seat. She picked up a pen and began jotting notes on a crew incident form. Non-compliant passenger, attempted to enter another cabin, refused to follow crew instructions, creating a disturbance. She wrote it in bullet points, framing the narrative the way she wanted it recorded. When this flight landed, she would file her report. Maybe she'd even recommend he be placed on the airline's no-fly list. Let corporate deal with him. Let him learn there were consequences for challenging her. Back in first class, Caleb tried to lose himself in his movie again, but his thoughts kept circling, He replayed the grip on his arm, the words, the tone. He thought about the people who had spoken up Victoria, Ethan, Tara, and wondered if they knew how much it mattered. He thought about his father, thousands of miles away, probably finishing up a meeting at Aurora Pacific's San Francisco headquarters, unaware of the small storm brewing on this flight. He considered sending a text through the in-flight Wi-Fi. Just a short one. He and his father had a code for when something wasn't right. A bit turbulent today. It was vague enough to mean nothing to anyone else, but his father would understand. Caleb waited in his mind for a moment, then decided to wait. No sense worrying him until they could talk face to face. Tara came back through to offer dessert. She leaned down slightly. "We've got chocolate mousse or fruit and cheese plate," she said. "Mousse, please," Caleb replied. As she set the dish on his tray, she lowered her voice. "For what it's worth, you've handled this better than most adults I've seen in situations like that." Caleb gave a small smile. "Thanks. I just don't see the point in yelling." She straightened. "Sometimes not yelling says more." From behind the curtain, the sound of footsteps approached. For a moment, Caleb thought Diane might try to return, but it was another attendant from business class coming through to assist Tara. Diane stayed out of sight. The remainder of the meal service passed without incident, but the undercurrent in the cabin was undeniable. Every so often, Caleb would catch a passenger glancing toward the curtain as if expecting something more to happen, and he suspected they were right. Diane didn't strike him as someone who would let the matter drop. The aircraft was somewhere over the Midwest now, slicing through the late afternoon sky. Sunlight poured through the windows at an angle, casting long beams across the cabin. Caleb took out his sketchbook again, flipping to a fresh page. His pencil moved slowly this time, tracing the outline of another bridge, taller, with stronger cables. In his mind, it wasn't just about architecture anymore. It was about connection, strength, endurance. He thought of what Victoria Lane had said, the way her voice had carried authority without needing to shout. He thought of Ethan Park's measured tone, offering truth like a simple fact. These were people who didn't have to be involved, but they chose to be, and that mattered, in the rear galley. Diane finished her incident notes and tucked them into her apron. She straightened her uniform, reapplied lipstick, and stared at her reflection in the small galley mirror. She told herself she was the victim of an orchestrated scene, that the boy had been coached, that maybe he was related to someone in the cabin who had influenced the others. The thought gave her a strange sense of confidence, as if believing it could make it true. She glanced toward the curtain and imagined stepping back into the first-class cabin, reclaiming her authority. But Captain Hale's voice echoed in her memory, calm but unyielding. "Go to the rear galley. Stay there until I come speak with you." She clenched her jaw. No, not yet, but soon. Caleb closed his sketchbook and placed it back in the side pocket. He leaned back, closing his eyes. For a few moments he just listened to the hum of the engines, the steady reminder that, for all the human tension inside, the aircraft itself was unbothered, carrying them closer to San Francisco. He didn't know that, at that very moment, Diane Mercer was imagining her own arrival walking off the plane with her head high, filing her report and making sure this passenger's name was marked in the system. She had no idea that forces far above her pay grade were already turning, set in motion by witnesses who would not let this go. For now, the curtain stayed closed, but both sides of it knew this was only an intermission. The next time Captain Hale emerged from the cockpit, it wasn't because of turbulence or a standard passenger request. He had received a quiet word from Tara, and his instincts told him there was more to this situation than what he'd heard earlier. The look in her eyes had been enough to confirm it. She wasn't the kind of crew member to exaggerate, and she didn't look rattled easily. When the captain stepped into the first-class cabin, the conversations dimmed again. His uniform seemed to carry its own gravity, and even the most self-assured passengers looked up from their tablets or glasses of wine. He moved slowly down the aisle, scanning the rows until his eyes settled on Caleb. "Mr. Anderson," he said, voice calm. "Would you mind stepping into the galley for a moment?" Caleb closed his sketchbook and stood. The eyes of Victoria Lane and Ethan Park followed him as he moved forward. He could feel the undercurrent of support from them, but also a faint nervousness once you stepped into a conversation like this. You couldn't step back out unchanged. Inside the small galley space, the captain kept his posture relaxed, but his tone sharpened. "Tell me exactly what happened earlier by the curtain." Caleb recounted it plainly. No flourishes, no raised voice. He described walking toward the business-class lavatory, Diane grabbing his arm, and her saying the words that still echoed like a bruise in his mind. The captain's expression remained steady, but his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Did you say anything to her before that?" the captain asked. "No, sir," Caleb replied. "I just told her the forward lavatory was in use." The captain nodded once. "Wait here a moment." He stepped out into the cabin and walked directly to Victoria Lane's seat. She looked up from her book as if expecting him. "Ma'am," Hale said, "did you witness an interaction between my lead flight attendant and Mr. Anderson?" "I did," Victoria replied, clear and unwavering. "And I heard every word. Your crew member laid her hands on him, unprovoked, and told him, and I quote, 'You people don't belong here.'" She let the words hang for a moment. "I have flown on this airline for decades. Captain, I've never seen anything so disgraceful in your premium cabin." Hale gave a short nod of acknowledgement. "Thank you, Ms. Lane." He moved next to Ethan Park, who had closed his laptop and was already leaning slightly into the aisle. Sir Ethan's voice was measured, like someone delivering a deposition. It happened as they've said. There was no disturbance until she created one. The kid was just trying to use the lavatory, and she grabbed him. She owes him an apology. Captain. By the time Hale returned to the galley, he had 3 consistent accounts: Caleb's, Victoria's, and Ethan's. Tara Nyen's quiet confirmation only added to the weight. "Mr. Anderson," Hale said, "please return to your seat. I'll take it from here." Caleb sat down again, trying to ignore the thud of his own pulse in his ears. Tara passed by, setting a fresh napkin on his tray, as if it were a silent shield. From the galley, the captain summoned Diane. She entered with her chin high, though her eyes flickered briefly when she saw who else was in the narrow space. Hale stood in front of the coffee maker like a barrier. "I've heard from 3 passengers and 1 crew member," Hale began, "and your account does not match theirs. In fact, every one of them contradicts you directly." "They're exaggerating," Diane said quickly. "The boy was acting entitled, trying to—" "The boy," Hale interrupted, "is a 17-year-old paying passenger in a confirmed first-class seat, and you put your hands on him. Then you used language that, in my cabin, is unacceptable under any circumstances." Diane's mouth opened, but no words came out. "You're done working this cabin for the remainder of the flight," Hale said. "Stay in the rear galley. Do not interact with the first-class passengers again. We'll discuss the rest after we land." She stood there a moment longer, then turned sharply and walked toward the curtain. The cabin seemed to exhale as she disappeared again. Victoria caught Caleb's eye and gave him the faintest nod. Ethan leaned back in his seat, a small signal that he was still paying attention. Tara moved with quiet purpose, taking over service for the cabin without missing a beat. Caleb sipped his Coke, the cold bite grounding him. He could still feel the sting of the earlier moment, but it was different now. He wasn't alone in it. There were people, strangers an hour ago, who had refused to stay silent, out of sight, in the back. Diane leaned against the counter, her mind spinning. She couldn't shake the look on the captain's face, the certainty in the passengers' voices. It was dangerous, she thought, how quickly perception could turn against you. In her mind, she was still the one in control, but that control had just been yanked from her hands. In first class, the atmosphere slowly began to mend. Tara served coffee and tea, offering a small extra dessert to those who had clearly been unsettled. Caleb returned to his sketchbook, adding the final cables to the bridge he'd been working on since takeoff. The rest of the passengers might not know it, but there was a shift happening beneath the surface. The story of what had been said, of who had stood up and who had not, was already written into the memory of this flight, and it wasn't going away. For now. Caleb focused on the graphite lines in front of him, making them strong, making them connect. He knew there was still more to come: the landing, the conversation with his father, but for the moment, the bridge was enough. The rest of the first-class cabin had almost settled back into a rhythm when Captain Hale returned once more. This time, he didn't stop in the aisle. He walked directly to the front bulkhead, where the interphone was mounted, and spoke briefly into it. His voice was low enough that no one could make out the words, but his tone carried authority. Whatever he was saying, it wasn't routine. Caleb pretended to focus on the in-flight map glowing on his screen, but his ears stayed tuned to every sound at the front. Hale hung up the phone, scanned the cabin with steady eyes, and then stepped toward Victoria Lane's row. "Ms. Lane," he said, "I'll be including your statement in my incident report to corporate. It will be noted exactly as you described it." Victoria, composed as always, simply replied, "That's all I ask." Hale moved to Ethan Park next. "Sir, I'll also be recording your account. Would you be willing to provide your contact information for a follow-up?" Ethan nodded. "Absolutely." He reached into his leather briefcase, pulled out a business card, and handed it over. "And, Captain, I think your corporate office should know this is not just about one passenger's comfort. It's about your brand and your reputation." Hale accepted the card with a curt nod. "I understand." The captain then turned to Caleb. He crouched slightly, so they were eye level. "Mr. Anderson, I want you to know you have been nothing but respectful during this situation. I appreciate the way you've handled yourself." "Thank you, sir," Caleb said quietly. "If there's anything you need during the remainder of this flight," Hale continued, "you come directly to me or Ms. Nguyen." "Yeah, sir." With that, Hale stood and stepped back into the galley, where Tara Nguyen was waiting with a clipboard. He began taking her statement, nodding occasionally, jotting notes. It was clear to anyone watching that the captain was taking this seriously, very seriously. Behind the curtain, in the rear galley, Diane Mercer was pacing in a tight circle. She could feel the walls closing in. The captain hadn't spoken to her again since ordering her out of the cabin. Each minute she spent back there was a reminder that her authority had been stripped away. She'd started out the day feeling in complete control of her environment, and now it felt like she was the one trapped. She tried to imagine how she could spin this when they landed. maybe claim the boy had misunderstood her words, maybe suggest the witnesses were mistaken or had an agenda. But even as she considered it, she knew the captain had heard enough credible voices to make her story look thin. Back up front, the atmosphere in first class shifted again. The tension hadn't disappeared, but a sense of order had been restored. Passengers returned to their books, movies, and quiet conversations. Still, every so often, Caleb caught someone glancing toward the curtain, as if waiting to see whether Diane would reappear. Victoria Lane eventually leaned toward him. "Young man," she said, her tone soft but deliberate, "you have remarkable composure. Don't let anyone make you question that." Caleb smiled faintly. "I just didn't want to make things worse." "Sometimes," Victoria replied. "Not escalating is the most powerful thing you can do. It leaves the truth standing on its own." "From across the aisle," Ethan Park added. "And when enough people see that truth, the wrong side doesn't stand a chance." The captain made one final round through the cabin before returning to the cockpit. He spoke briefly to a flight attendant from economy, giving instructions about who would be handling certain duties until they landed. Then, without ceremony, he disappeared behind the reinforced door. Caleb glanced at the in-flight map again. They were somewhere over Colorado now, with less than 2 hours to go before touching down in San Francisco. Part of him wanted the flight to be over already, to step off the plane and put the incident behind him. But another part of him, the part that had grown up in the shadow of his father's quiet power, knew that some moments were not meant to be brushed aside. Some were meant to be addressed carefully, firmly, and in the light. He hadn't told anyone who his father was. Not Victoria, not Ethan, not even Tara. He knew what would happen if he did. The energy in the cabin would shift again, this time in a way that might feel less like justice and more like fear. For now, he wanted the truth to stand without the weight of a title behind it. But he also knew that his father would hear about this before the day was over. Whether through his own telling or through corporate channels, Caleb Anderson Sr. would know exactly what happened between his son and Diane Mercer. And when he did, the ripple would be much larger than one flight. In the rear galley. Diane checked her watch for the 10th time in as many minutes. She could feel the hum of the engines through the floor, the steady forward movement toward a destination she was starting to dread. She told herself she'd done nothing wrong, at least nothing worth this level of scrutiny. But every time she replayed the scene, she heard her own voice in her head, sharp and unmistakable. "You people don't belong here." Even she couldn't pretend those words hadn't been said. The first-class cabin stayed calm for the next half hour, but it was the kind of calm that comes after a storm, not before one. Caleb went back to sketching, shading the cables of his bridge so they looked taut and unbreakable. Victoria sipped her tea, eyes occasionally flicking toward the galley. Ethan typed, but every few minutes, he paused to look out the window as if measuring the distance to landing. Tara continued her service with professionalism, but she didn't let her guard down. She moved with an awareness that was sharper than before, as if ready to step in again if anything else sparked. And beneath it all, Caleb felt something building. Not just the natural end to the flight, but the sense that the real confrontation, the one that would have lasting consequences, was still ahead. When the wheels touched down in San Francisco, the incident wouldn't just stay in the logbook. It would be remembered, and by the time they reached the gate, it might already be in the hands of someone who could decide what came next. Caleb knew his father well enough to know that when that moment came, there would be no need for raised voices or public scenes, just quiet decisions that could change careers, reputations, and perhaps even the way the airline handled moments like this in the future. For now, the captain had taken full control of the flight. But the next phase, the one no one in the cabin besides Caleb could see coming, was about to begin. The cabin lights dimmed as the seatbelt sign chimed on. Outside, the California coastline was coming into view. Streaks of gold sunlight cutting across the Pacific as the aircraft began its slow descent toward San Francisco. The shift in altitude brought a subtle change in energy inside the cabin. People adjusted seatbacks, stowed laptops, and finished the last sips of coffee or wine. Caleb closed his sketchbook and slid it into his backpack. The bridge on the page felt complete now, a quiet, personal symbol of strength. But his thoughts were no longer on architecture. They were on the conversation he knew was coming, the one with his father. For most of the flight, he had kept his phone on airplane mode, ignoring the temptation of the in-flight Wi-Fi. Now, as the descent began, he pulled it from the seat pocket. The rules said devices should stay on airplane mode until they were on the ground, but there was no rule against drafting a message. His thumbs hovered over the screen before he typed 4 words, "A bit turbulent today." It was their code, the phrase he and his father had agreed upon years ago for situations where something was wrong but couldn't be explained yet. It wasn't about weather. It was about people. He didn't hit send yet. He wanted the message to go through the second they touched down. From the rear galley. Diane Mercer reappeared for the first time in hours. She walked briskly up the aisle, head high, stopping at the curtain between business and first class. She didn't step through, but she looked in, sweeping her gaze across the passengers. Her eyes lingered on Caleb for half a second before she continued toward the forward galley. Taran Guyen noticed immediately and moved to intercept her. "Diane," she said quietly. The captain's orders were clear. "I'm just securing the cabin," Diane replied, her voice flat but clipped. "I've already got first class covered," Tara said. "You're needed in the back." For a moment, it looked like Diane might push through anyway. Her fingers twitched near the curtain, the desire to reclaim control almost visible. But then she turned sharply and disappeared again. Victoria Lane leaned across the aisle toward Caleb. "That woman's pride is going to cost her more than she realizes," she murmured. Ethan Park gave a quiet hum of agreement without looking away from the window. The descent continued, the plane banking gently over the bay. The city unfolded beneath them bridges, neighborhoods, the shimmer of water catching the light. Caleb felt his heartbeat pick up. San Francisco wasn't just another stop on a flight itinerary for him. It was home base, and more importantly, it was where his father's office sat, overlooking the very runways they would be landing on. Captain Hale's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our final approach into San Francisco International Airport. Please make sure your seatbacks are upright, tray tables are stowed, and all carry-on items are secured. Cabin crew, please prepare for landing." Tara moved through the aisle with practiced efficiency, checking latches, glancing at belts. When she reached Caleb's row, she paused. "We'll be on the ground in a few minutes." "You doing okay? I'm fine," Caleb said. "Thanks for looking out for me." Her expression softened. "You've been handling this like a pro. Your parents should be proud." Caleb just smiled faintly. "One of them will definitely have some thoughts about it." She raised an eyebrow, but didn't press. The landing gear dropped with a muffled thud, and a few passengers glanced instinctively out the window. Caleb focused on his phone again, the unsent message glowing back at him. The wheels hit the runway a moment later with a jolt, followed by the rising whine of reverse thrust. The aircraft slowed, taxied, and finally rolled toward the gate. The instant the nose gear crossed the painted line at the jet bridge, Caleb tapped send. The message streaked into the air, toward a man whose phone would light up in a top-floor office less than a mile away, in the rear galley. Diane's jaw tightened. She was rehearsing her version of events in her head, imagining the conversation with the base manager who would meet them. She still believed she could frame the narrative to her advantage if she spoke quickly enough. Up front, the seatbelt sign went off. Passengers stood, reaching for overhead bins, stretching stiff limbs. Caleb stayed seated for a moment, waiting. He knew better than to rush. Victoria stood and reached for her bag, then paused to give him a look. "You walk off this plane like the gentleman you've been all day," she said. "Yes, ma'am," Caleb replied. Ethan Park, slinging his briefcase over his shoulder, leaned in just enough to say, "If you ever decide to work in tech, look me up. People like you are rare." Caleb thanked him, tucking the offer away in the back of his mind. Tara came by one last time. "Have a good evening, Mr. Anderson," she said, with a warmth that felt genuine. "You too," he replied. When the aisle began to move, Caleb stood, collected his backpack, and stepped forward. The curtain to the galley was open now, and Diane stood there, stiff-backed, her eyes flicking to him and away again. Neither spoke. As he stepped into the jet bridge, cool air replacing the stale cabin atmosphere, Caleb spotted a figure standing just beyond the gate, tall, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit, with the calm, commanding presence of someone used to being listened to. Caleb's chest tightened, not from fear, but from recognition. His father was waiting. The look they exchanged was brief, but full of unspoken understanding. Caleb didn't have to say a word. His father could read everything in his eyes. "Come with me," Caleb Anderson Sr. said, his voice low but steady, and just like that. The next chapter of the day began one that would move far beyond the walls of a single aircraft. The hum of conversation in the terminal faded as Caleb walked beside his father. Passengers streamed past, rolling suitcases clicking against the polished floor. But in that moment, it felt like the crowd moved around them rather than with them. Caleb could feel the quiet tension radiating from his father, not anger exactly, but a focused stillness that was more dangerous than any raised voice. They stopped just beyond the gate area where Captain Hale was standing, speaking with a uniformed ground manager. The captain looked up as soon as he saw Caleb's father, his expression sharpening in recognition. "Mr. Anderson," Hale said, stepping forward. "I didn't expect to see you here personally." "I was already at headquarters when I got my son's message," Caleb's father replied. His tone was polite, but each word was weighed, deliberate. "I thought it best to hear about this from the people involved." Hale nodded, glancing briefly toward Caleb. "Your son handled himself with respect throughout the entire incident. I'll be filing a full report. I appreciate that." Anderson Sr. said, "I'd like to hear your account before I speak to anyone else." The captain gestured toward a quiet seating area just off the concourse. They moved away from the flow of passengers, sitting at a table near the window where the faint rumble of taxiing jets filled the background. Hale laid it out cleanly, the witness statements, the corroboration from Taran Guyen, his own observation of Diane Mercer's behavior. He didn't embellish, but neither did he soften. Caleb's father listened without interrupting, his hands folded loosely on the table, his eyes fixed on the captain. When Hale finished, Anderson Sr. asked one question. "Was there any ambiguity about what was said to my son?" "No, sir," Hale replied. Multiple passengers heard the exact words. Anderson Sr. leaned back slightly, as though filing that answer away in a mental ledger. Then I'll speak to the crew member directly. The ground manager shifted uneasily. Sir, she's in the crew lounge right now. I'll go there. Anderson Sr. said, standing. Captain, would you join me? Hale rose without hesitation. Caleb followed, a silent presence just a step behind his father. The walk to the crew lounge felt longer than it was. Each turn down the terminal hallway, tightening the anticipation in Caleb's chest. When they entered, Diane Mercer was seated in a corner, still in uniform, arms crossed. She looked up at the sound of the door, her expression flickering from guarded to something sharper when she recognized Caleb. Ms. Mercer. Anderson Sr. said evenly. I'm Caleb Anderson. I believe you've met my son. For a beat, she said nothing. Then, with a trace of forced composure, I didn't realize that he was my son, Anderson. Senior, finished? That shouldn't matter. Every passenger in your cabin deserves the same standard of respect. She straightened in her seat. Sir, I believe there's been a misunderstanding. I was following policy, ensuring the safety and comfort of our passengers, by putting your hands on him and telling him he didn't belong. The question was delivered without a raise in volume, but the weight behind it pressed into the room. Her eyes darted toward Hale, then back to Anderson Sr. Those words have been taken out of context. Caleb's father leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping into a quieter register. There is no context in which those words, directed at a paying passenger, are acceptable. None. Diane opened her mouth again, but no answer came. The silence was broken only by the faint hum of the lounge's air system. I don't intend to debate this with you here, Anderson Sr. said at last. The captain will make his report. Our HR and compliance divisions will conduct their review, effective immediately. You are relieved from active duty pending the outcome of that process. She blinked, the realization settling in. You're suspending me. I'm protecting the integrity of my airline, he replied. You'll be contacted with details. For now, you're free to leave the airport. Her jaw tightened, but she stood, smoothing the front of her uniform as though the small gesture could hold together something that was already fracturing. Without another word, she walked out of the lounge. When the door closed behind her, Hale exhaled quietly. I've never seen her spoken to like that. I don't enjoy it, Anderson Sr. said, but allowing that kind of behavior to go unchecked would be far worse. He turned to Caleb then, his expression softening slightly. You okay? I'm fine, Caleb said. I just didn't want you to have to deal with it on a day like this. His father shook his head. This is exactly the kind of thing I have to deal with. And you handled it the right way. You let the facts speak, and you stayed calm. Caleb hesitated, then asked, What happens now? Now, his father said, we make sure this doesn't disappear into a drawer. It goes on record, and we find out if this is part of a pattern. Hale nodded. I'll see to it that every detail is in my report, sir. Anderson Sr. placed a hand on his son's shoulder, a small gesture but grounding. Go wait for me in the car. I won't be long. Caleb left the lounge, the tension in his chest loosening slightly as he walked back toward the main terminal. Through the glass, he could see the fading light outside, planes taxiing in lines, the pulse of the airport still moving regardless of individual dramas. Back in the lounge, Anderson Sr. was already making notes in his phone, his mind shifting from immediate confrontation to broader implications. If a lead flight attendant felt comfortable enough to say something like that in a first-class cabin, it meant there were cracks in training, oversight, or both. Cracks he intended to seal. Captain Hale remained standing, watching him. "You're going to make an example of this," he said. "I'm going to make sure we never have to have this conversation again." Anderson Sr. replied. The next morning, the headquarters of Aurora Pacific Airlines looked the same on the outside. Glass panels reflected the rising sun, the company's silver and blue logo catching the light. But inside, the atmosphere was anything but ordinary. A call had gone out late the night before summoning key executives to a special meeting in the executive boardroom. Caleb Anderson Sr. entered first. His steps measured, suit immaculate. He didn't carry a stack of papers or a laptop, only a slim leather folio. The kind of man who didn't need a pile of documents to prove a point. One by one, the others arrived: the Chief Operating Officer, the VP of HR, the Director of Cabin Services, and the Head of Legal Affairs. Captain Robert Hale came in last, uniform pressed, a bound incident report in his hand. When everyone had taken their seats, Anderson Sr. began without preamble. "You've all read the preliminary summary from the captain. Today, we decide how we respond not just to one crew member's misconduct, but to the culture that allowed it to happen in a premium cabin on one of our flagship routes." The VP of HR, a woman named Karen Holt, shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, before we proceed, I think it's important we acknowledge that the crew member in question has been with us for 22 years. Until now, her record has been clean. Clean on paper," Anderson Sr. replied. "That doesn't mean incidents didn't occur. It might mean they weren't reported or weren't taken seriously." The Director of Cabin Services, Malcolm Reed, cleared his throat. "I have to admit, there have been murmurs about her attitude toward certain passengers. Nothing concrete, but enough to suggest a bias." Anderson Sr.'s gaze sharpened. "And why was that not addressed?" Reed hesitated. "Without a formal complaint, it's difficult to. That's the problem." Anderson Sr. cut in. "Our passengers shouldn't have to navigate a maze of formalities to be treated with basic respect. This isn't just about Diane Mercer. It's about accountability." Captain Hale placed his report on the table. "I've documented the exact sequence of events, including witness statements from passengers and crew. There is no ambiguity about what was said or done. I recommend permanent removal from passenger-facing duties." Karen Holt looked uneasy. "That's effectively termination. That's exactly what it is." Anderson Sr. said, his tone even. "And it sends a message. If someone with over 2 decades of service can lose their position for crossing a line like this, then everyone understands the line is real." The Head of Legal Affairs, Samuel Ortiz, spoke up. "From a legal standpoint, as long as the documentation is solid, we're on firm ground. There's also the reputational aspect to consider. If this story leaks and given the passengers involved, I'd say that's likely it could either damage us or demonstrate that we take decisive action." Anderson Sr. nodded slowly. "Exactly. The public will decide which way it goes based on what we do right now." Silence settled for a moment. The weight of the decision hung heavy over the table. Then Reed finally said, "If we terminate Mercer, we also need to launch a review of training protocols. We can't just cut her loose and pretend the system worked as intended." "I agree," Anderson Sr. said, "which is why, effective immediately, I'm authorizing a top-to-bottom audit of our cabin crew training with a specific focus on unconscious bias and passenger relations. Every crew member, from the most junior to the most senior, will complete it within the next 90 days. No exceptions." Karen Holt scribbled notes, her expression still tight but resigned. "Understood." Anderson Sr. leaned forward, his voice dropping slightly. This is not about overreacting. This is about protecting the soul of the brand we've built. Aurora Pacific is more than a transportation service. It's an experience. And when someone tells a paying passenger, "You don't belong here," they're not just insulting that passenger. They're insulting the entire company, Samuel Ortiz added. "If I may, sir, it might be wise to prepare a public statement now. That way, if the story does surface, we're not scrambling to respond." "I'll draft it myself," Anderson Sr. said. "It will be clear, concise, and unapologetic in its commitment to dignity for every passenger." Hale spoke again. "Sir, there's something else. Your son, the way he handled himself. I've flown for over 30 years, and I've never seen a young passenger respond with that kind of calm under pressure. It was remarkable." There was a flicker of warmth in Anderson Sr.'s eyes, but his voice remained steady. "He's been raised to know that character speaks louder than volume." He paused, then added, "And it's my job to make sure the company reflects the same values I expect of him." The meeting continued for another 20 minutes, hammering out Logistics Mercer's suspension paperwork, coordination with union representatives, the structure of the training review. When it adjourned, there was no applause, no self-congratulation, just a collective understanding that a line had been drawn, and crossing it had consequences. As the others filed out, Hale lingered. "Sir, if you'd like, I can speak to your son directly before I head back to Boston. He deserves to hear that what he did mattered. I think he'd appreciate that." Anderson Sr. said, "He's at home now. I'll have my driver bring him by before your shuttle." When the captain left, Anderson Sr. stood alone in the boardroom for a moment, looking out through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the runways below. A jet was taking off, its nose lifting against the pale morning sky. He thought about how easily a single person's actions could cast a shadow over an entire operation, and how just as quickly a single act of integrity could set it right again. He opened his folio and pulled out a single sheet of paper, the public statement draft. The first sentence was already written in his mind. Aurora Pacific Airlines has always believed that every passenger belongs in the seat they purchased, regardless of race, background, or any other factor. Yesterday, one of our own failed to uphold that standard. Today, we're making it clear that this is unacceptable. The rest would come easily, outside. The day was fully awake now, sunlight spilling across the tarmac. The work of running an airline went on: flights to dispatch, schedules to adjust, crews to brief. But for Anderson Sr., the day's most important flight had already landed, and its lessons would carry far beyond the runway. By the end of the week, Diane Mercer's name was no longer on the active crew roster. Her personnel file had been moved to a restricted HR folder marked "Finalized, Termination." For someone who had once been a senior figure in the cabin crew, the fall was abrupt and absolute. In a small apartment far from the airport, Diane sat at her kitchen table, staring at a sealed envelope from Aurora Pacific's HR department. She had read the contents twice already, but kept opening it as if the words might change. Termination, effective immediately. Severance limited to accrued benefits. She knew the union would offer minimal help. Her case was weak, and the witnesses were too credible to dispute. She thought back to that day on Flight 227, the look on Caleb's face when she told him he didn't belong. At the time, it had felt like authority. Now, in the quiet of her own kitchen, it echoed as something else, entirely a choice she couldn't take back, one that had rewritten the final chapter of her career. Across town, the headquarters of Aurora Pacific was moving forward. In the training center, The first wave of crew members had already begun the new program on unconscious bias and passenger dignity. Modules were interactive, forcing participants to confront scenarios they'd often avoided in discussion. Taranguyen had volunteered to be one of the early facilitators, believing that her first-hand perspective could make the lessons hit harder. In the Anderson home, Caleb sat on the back porch with a mug of hot chocolate, his sketchbook resting beside him. The winter air was cool enough to turn his breath into faint clouds. He flipped through his drawings, not just the bridge from the flight, but pages filled over months' buildings, landscapes, street corners from his neighborhood. His father stepped outside, a coffee in hand. "Cold out here," he said, settling into the chair next to him. "I like it," Caleb replied. "Makes it easier to think." For a moment they just sat, the faint hum of the city in the distance. Then Caleb said, "I've been wondering if she even realizes how much it matters. What she said." His father took a slow sip before answering. "Some people only realize the weight of their words when it's too late. But whether she does or not, that's not on you. You didn't cause this." Caleb looked down at his hands. "I didn't do anything to stop it either. I just sat there." "You stayed calm," his father said firmly. "That gave everyone else the space to act. The witnesses, the captain, even me. If you had reacted the way she expected, this might have gone differently." Caleb didn't answer right away. His father let the silence stretch, knowing his son was turning the thought over. "Finally," Caleb said, "it feels strange. I didn't fight her, but it still feels like I won. I don't even like calling it that." "It's not about winning or losing," his father replied. "It's about standing on the right side of a line. Sometimes that means speaking up in the moment. Sometimes it means holding steady until the truth catches up." They sat for a while longer before his father's phone buzzed with a message. He glanced at the screen, then said, "Captain Hale wanted me to tell you he appreciated your composure." He said it reminded him of why he still flies after all these years. Caleb smiled faintly. "I'm glad he was there. And Tara." His father nodded. "People like that keep the whole thing from falling apart." In another part of the city, Victoria Lane wrote a letter to the Airline's Public Affairs Department, praising Caleb's conduct and urging them to keep reinforcing the changes being made. Ethan Park, back in Boston, mentioned the incident in a keynote speech at a tech conference not as gossip, but as an example of why leadership needed to be present at every level of an organization. Diane, meanwhile, found herself fielding calls from former colleagues who wanted to know what had happened. Some expressed sympathy, others kept their voices carefully neutral. She told most of them the same thing, that it had been a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. But alone, she wondered if maybe it hadn't been. For Caleb, life began to settle back into its normal rhythm: school, homework, afternoons at the community center where he helped younger kids with art projects. Yet there was a subtle shift in how he saw things now. In the grocery store, at the bus stop, on the sidewalk, he noticed how quickly people made judgments about others, sometimes without even realizing it. One afternoon, as he was leaving the community center, a younger boy named Jordan asked him, "Is it true you were on a flight where a lady tried to make you leave your seat?" Caleb hesitated before answering. "Yeah, that happened." "Did you yell at her?" Jordan asked, wide-eyed. "No," Caleb said. "I just stayed calm and let other people see what was happening. Sometimes that's louder than yelling." Jordan seemed to think about that for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Cool." At home that evening, Caleb added a new page to his sketchbook. Not a building this time, but a simple drawing of an airplane seat, sunlight streaming across it, beneath it. He wrote a single sentence. "You belong here." He didn't know yet what he'd do with the drawing, but it felt important to keep. That night, as the city lights came on, Caleb's father stood in his office looking at the final draft of the airline's public statement. It was set to go live the next morning. Reading it one last time, he felt a quiet certainty settle in his chest. This wasn't just about one crew member, one flight, or one passenger. It was about the kind of company and the kind of world he wanted to leave for his son. The press release went out at exactly 9 sur mi on Monday. Within minutes, it was picked up by major travel blogs, local news outlets, and a handful of national media sites. The wording was direct, almost disarmingly so for a corporate statement. It named the incident as unacceptable, described the disciplinary action taken, and outlined the new training initiatives being implemented across the company. It ended with a single line that caught attention everywhere it appeared. Every passenger belongs in the seat they purchased, always. The reaction was immediate. On social media, passengers who had flown with Aurora Pacific shared positive experiences, tagging the airline's account with comments like, "This is how you do it," and finally, a company taking real action. Some shared stories of discrimination they had faced on other airlines, wishing those carriers would respond the same way. At headquarters, the communications team kept watch on the feed, logging reactions. By noon, the sentiment analysis showed an overwhelming majority in favor of the airline's decision. The legal team reported no significant blowback from the union. Diane Mercer had quietly signed her severance agreement, likely recognizing that a fight would only keep the story alive longer. Caleb was at school when one of his classmates showed him the article on their phone. "Dude, your dad's airline is all over the news," the boy said. "They're saying you were the passenger." Caleb glanced at the headline, then at the photo of his father that accompanied the piece. "Yeah," he said simply, sliding the phone back. "That was me." He didn't offer more, and his classmate didn't press. But in the quiet between classes, Caleb found himself thinking about how quickly a private moment could turn public and how important it was to make sure the public part reflected the truth. That afternoon, his father came home earlier than usual. He found Caleb in the living room, sketchbook open on his lap. "Thought you might want to see this," Anderson Sr. said, handing him a printed packet. It was the internal memo distributed to all Aurora Pacific employees that morning. It didn't just detail the new training it named Caleb, with his permission, as an example of grace under pressure. The memo described his composure and how it had allowed the crew and other passengers to act without escalation. Caleb read it twice before setting it down. "Feels weird seeing my name in something like that," he admitted. His father smiled faintly. "Weird good or weird bad?" "Both," Caleb said, "but maybe more good. Over the next few weeks." The reforms began to take shape. Training sessions filled conference rooms at airports across the country. New reporting channels were launched, making it easier for passengers and employees to flag concerns in real time. Tara Nguyen became part of the official Diversity and Inclusion Committee, her input shaping policies that would have felt impossible to implement before. One evening, Captain Hale sent Caleb a photo of the new crew handbook. On the inside cover, printed in bold letters, was the same sentence from the press release. "Every passenger belongs in the seat they purchased. Always." Caleb saved the image to his phone. In the spring, Caleb and his father flew together again, this time from San Francisco to New York for a charity gala. As they boarded, several crew members greeted them by name, not in the rehearsed way of customer service, but with genuine warmth. Caleb noticed the difference. The greetings were the same for every passenger, regardless of their seat or their appearance. Midway through the flight, Tara stopped by their row. "I'm glad to see you two flying again," she said. "It's good for people to see that we can move forward after something like that." Caleb nodded. "It feels different this time, in a good way." When they landed, a young flight attendant working her first month with the airline caught up to Caleb in the jet bridge. "Hey," she said, a little shyly, "I just wanted to say I heard about what happened before I joined. It made me want to work here, because you stayed calm, and because the company actually did something about it." Caleb didn't know what to say at first. Then he smiled and said, "I'm glad you're here." Months later, the incident was no longer trending online, no longer fresh in the public's mind, but its effects lingered quietly in the way crews spoke to passengers, in the way training modules were updated, in the way reporting systems worked behind the scenes. The airline had changed, and so had Caleb. One summer afternoon, Caleb sat at his desk, flipping through his sketchbook. Near the back, he found the drawing he'd made after that day on Flight 227. The empty airplane seat with sunlight across it. Beneath it, the words, "You belong here." He tore the page out carefully and slipped it into an envelope. On the front, he wrote, "For the Aurora Pacific Training Center." He didn't add a note inside. The drawing would speak for itself. A week later, the training center director framed it and hung it in the main classroom, where every new hire would see it on their first day. Caleb never went to check. He didn't need to. For him, closure didn't come from knowing the whole world had seen what happened. It came from knowing that the next time someone like him sat in a first-class seat, there would be one less chance of hearing the words, "You don't belong here." And if they ever did, the people around them would know exactly what to do. In the end, it wasn't shouting that changed anything. It wasn't power used to crush, but power used to correct. Caleb's calm refusal to be diminished spoke louder than any argument, and his father's decisive action proved that leadership isn't about titles. It's about protecting the dignity of others. But make no mistake, what happened on Flight 227 was wrong. Words like "you don't belong here" have no place in the skies or anywhere else. They cut deep, they leave scars, and they remind us that prejudice still hides in plain sight. This story is more than an airline incident. It's a call to all of us, to see, to speak, to act when dignity is at risk, to create spaces where every person, regardless of race or background, truly belongs. If this story touched you, share it. Let it start conversations. Let it remind us that change doesn't always start with noise. It can start with stillness, with a look, with a line drawn in the quiet, like share, and subscribe to stay with us for more stories that challenge, inspire, and move us towards something better. Because the next story we tell could be the one that changes everything.